Kathleen Wren Christian is now Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Munich's Institute für Kunstgeschichte, and she will begin her new position as lecturer at the Open University in Milton Keynes in the UK. One of the great things about these get-togethers is you meet some people you haven't met and long to get to know better. She has such distinguished publications, and especially which has received enormous praise: Empire Without End, Antiquities Collections in Renaissance Rome, that came out in 2010. I haven't read it yet, but I know I want to. Hearty greeting to Kathleen Christian.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the wonderful invitation to speak at the conference, to all the organizers. So could I have a little bit less light here for just a moment? Okay. So, in his first surviving letter, Michelangelo describes the first day he had ever spent in Rome. In July 1496, the 21-year-old artist wrote to his patron and protector, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, in Florence. Upon arrival in Rome the week before, Michelangelo writes, he had gone to see Cardinal Raffaele Riario with de' Medici's letter of introduction in hand. Riario received Michelangelo with the urgent request that he go and look at certain figures, undoubtedly antique sculptures, as will become clear later, and the artist occupied himself with his task for the rest of the day. On the following day, Michelangelo met Riario at the building site of the cardinal's new palazzo. When the cardinal asked Michelangelo's opinion on what he had just seen, the artist replied, "There are certainly many beautiful things." When Riario then asked Michelangelo if he had the spirit to do something beautiful for him, the artist writes, "I told him I would not do such great things, si gran cose, but he would see what I could do." The pair then bought a block of marble large enough for a life-size figure, and Michelangelo would begin work on Monday. This figure, as we now know, was Michelangelo's Bacchus, carved over the next 13 months in the house of Riario's neighbor, banker, and aide-de-camp Jacopo Galli. The history of this commission is exceedingly complex and overshadowed by a number of unsolved mysteries. Time permits only a brief summary of these before returning to Michelangelo's letter. Michelangelo came to Rome after Cardinal Riario had bought a statue of a sleeping Cupid that he believed to be an antique, but discovered was actually modern. Riario returned the Cupid and demanded his money back, yet his admiration for the Cupid's modern-day creator, we are told by Michelangelo's biographers, inspired him to seek out his true identity. When Riario's agents discovered that it was Michelangelo who had carved the Cupid, Riario supposedly invited the artist to Rome, leading to the commission for the Bacchus. At the time, the cardinal was in the midst of constructing the city's largest and most luxurious palace, what would later be known as the Cancelleria, and it is assumed that he commissioned Michelangelo's Bacchus for this setting, to complement the small but impressive collection of antique sculpture he displayed there, the highlight of which was this over-life-size statue of a muse on view in the palace courtyard, as is shown here. Michelangelo carved the Bacchus in the house of Jacopo Galli, as we have seen, next door to the Cancelleria, the Palazzo Riario. Bewilderingly enough, however, it seems that Riario never took possession of Michelangelo's Bacchus, even though the cardinal paid a generous sum for the figure in 3 documented installments. The statue was described as still being in Galli's house in 1505, and then when the Netherlandish artist Martin van Heemskerk visited Rome in the 1530s, as we've seen yesterday, some 20 years after Jacopo Galli's death, he observed the Bacchus still in place in the Palazzo Galli, now in the midst of an antiquities garden. In van Heemskerk's drawing, the Bacchus is missing its right hand and cup. By the 1530s, then, the hand had been broken off, accidentally or purposefully, we don't know. so that in the context of the Galli garden, the Bacchus appears to be disguised as an antique work. By the 1550s, however, the hand and cup had already been reattached, and the figure appeared as it does today, repaired at the wrist. It seems that while carving the Bacchus, Michelangelo developed a close friendship with Jacopo Galli and a deep antipathy for Cardinal Riario. The biography of Michelangelo by Condivi, written in 1553, assumed to be close to the voice of the artist himself, even claimed that Jacopo Galli, not Riario, had commissioned the Bacchus, and that Cardinal Riario had never asked for anything from Michelangelo because he had no understanding of art. We are left with the perplexing questions of why Riario fully paid for the Bacchus but never took possession of it, why Michelangelo and his biographers would try to conceal the fact that the cardinal had commissioned it in the first place, and how the sculpture's hand was lost and then returned. I can offer no solutions to these problems today, but hope instead to bring a new perspective on the Bacchus by reconsidering Michelangelo's letter, in particular its allusion to certe figure, certain figures, through the lens of Rome's antiquarian culture and its spectacular collections of antique sculpture. In the vast literature about the Bacchus, the letter has been undervalued in favor of what was written about the statue 50 years after the fact by Michelangelo's biographers. Yet even if the artist himself composed this letter as if it reported a real dialogue between patron and artist, we need not take it at face value. Michelangelo puts his position vis-a-vis Riario, one of Rome's most powerful and wealthy men, in the best possible light here. The cardinal has an urgent request for the artist and seeks out his expert opinion, while for the eyes of his other patron, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, Michelangelo shows himself fully in control of what he will carve. He will see what I can do, he writes. Cardinal Riario, however, no doubt had his own ideas about the Bacchus, and the letter even refers to the specific assignment he had in mind for Michelangelo in preparation for carving the statue. Volle incontinente ch'io andasse a vedere certe figure. He wanted incontinently that I go and look at certain figures. Antique ones, since there simply was no other comparanda available at the time. This task has sometimes been imagined as an unstructured walk around Rome to absorb the lessons of the antique, yet such an idea is contradicted by the specificity of the certe figure, the certain figures. Another proposal, one now universally repeated in the literature, is that Riario sent Michelangelo to look at his own collection of antiquities. It seems highly probable to me that Michelangelo would have gone to see Riario's muse, if only to get a sense of its scale and setting. And I would return to the question of scale in a moment. But I also think it unlikely that Michelangelo would have been limited to the works in Riario's small collection. There is so much about the Bacchus that suggests that Riario imagined it as his dream antiquity, a substitute for an antique sculpture he wanted but could not wait to be discovered. In the 1490s, Riario and his peers were obsessively collecting the best examples of classical statuary in a tight and fiercely competitive market, and much of what we hear about the Bacchus's commission situates it in the framework of this collecting culture. Michelangelo's arrival in Rome as the forger of a costly sleeping Cupid, for example, or the Bacchus's display with a broken hand in the Garden of the Galli. What antiquities, then, didn't Riario have, and what might he have wanted? The letter itself may provide some clues. When Riario asked Michelangelo if he had the spirit to do something beautiful for him, the artist replied, "I will not do such gran cose." This gran cose is almost impossible to translate. It could mean such great things as I have here, such grand and impressive things, such large things, all of which makes his reply seem quite irreverent, again calling Michelangelo's full disclosure here into question. Yet perhaps the most plausible reading of the reported exchange, one first suggested by Michael Hurst, is that it reflects a negotiation over the figure's size. I will not do such large things, he might have meant, especially since in the next sentence he writes, "We then bought a life-sized block of marble, and I will begin work Monday." Michelangelo, it should be remembered, had just carved the over 7-foot-high Hercules in Florence what would have been regarded by Riario as an exceptional achievement, and the cardinal may have known and sought out Michelangelo as one of the only living sculptors judged able to carve a larger than life-size sculpture, a figure perhaps large enough to complement Riario's muse, or at least to stand comfortably in the grandiose architecture of the Palazzo Riario itself. But before extending the range of our investigation further, I want to briefly consider how the statue's relationship with the antique has been regarded in the art historical literature. Especially in scholarship before the 1950s, formal or iconographic parallels were sought with antique works. In its form, the figure was rather unsuccessfully compared to a young Antinous or a Doryphorus in contrapposto. Also, without particular success, its content and narrative were compared to those of antique figures of Bacchus. Yet given the lack of any obvious statuary prototype for the Bacchus, in particular, the worrying absence of an antique Bacchus that looks reassuringly like Michelangelo's Bacchus, scholars have tended to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Given the lingering idea that the proposed antique prototypes for the Bacchus are merely, as David Summers has called them, a crowd of ugly sculptures, most readings have put Michelangelo in rivalry with more worthy opponents from the realm of philosophy and poetry. A nuanced interpretative tradition established by Egbert Vend in the 1950s, developed by Summers in the 1980s, and continued today, contextualizes the work with literary descriptions of the antique Bacchus in Plato, Callistratus, and Ovid, with Pliny's description of a lost Bacchus in bronze by Praxiteles, and most importantly, with the Neoplatonism of Michelangelo's Medici Circle. This interpretation has opened up new worlds by exposing the statue's complex engagement with literary and poetic themes. Yet it underplays the figure's relationship with antique sculpture and it's also its place in the context of antiques collecting at the time. Before the 1980s, art historians proposed ancient models for the Bacchus without the benefit of focused research on Rome's collections, and they often compared the work to statues excavated long after the artist's death. Yet now, after decades of research, we know enough to be more precise, not only asking what Michelangelo could have seen and where, but also what these figures might have meant to patron and artist, going beyond the abstractions of typology and iconography to ground the Bacchus's pseudo-antiqueness firmly within the reception of real antiquities at the time. Setting these goals, however, is much easier than achieving them. It requires assessing a patron's intentions in a work that might not have met his expectations. We cannot, moreover, expect to find simple correspondences between antique and modern in Michelangelo's creation, not only because the Bacchus is a product of its own time, echoing the Florentine masters Donatello, Verrocchio, and Bertoldo, as we have seen, but also because the artist's approach to all'antica imitation was a deeply imaginative one, involving the broad study of many models, the use of good judgment to select the most excellent ones, and the application of fantasia to produce something entirely new. The identification of Cardinal Riario's certain figures might be made easier, however, if we consider Riario's identity as a cardinal and collector in 1496. And no matter if the results may have disappointed him, if we imagine that he conceived the Bacchus as his fantasy antique. In thinking of which certain figures he wished Michelangelo to rival in this context, it is difficult to imagine that these included a Bacchus on the side of a sarcophagus in a darkened corner of just anybody's chapel. It seems almost certain, on the other hand, that Riario would have asked Michelangelo on that Saturday to look at Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere's Apollo Belvedere. Not only did the Apollo belong to Riario's cousin and closest peer and rival at the papal court, but it was probably the most widely acclaimed antique work then in private hands, as Professor Kaiser mentioned yesterday. The Apollo established the preference among wealthy cardinals and popes for life-sized or larger, relatively complete statues of nude or semi-nude mythological figures, like this Hercules, which was at the time of Michelangelo's arrival in Rome on display at the palace of Cardinal Francesco Piccolomini, This antique Polyphemus, then on view in the collection of Cardinal Lorenzo Cibo at Palazzo San Marco, or a now lost sleeping nymph at the palace of another member of Riario's extended family, Cardinal Domenico della Rovere. This type of collecting is the product of the new wealth, influence, and architectural ambitions of cardinal nephews who could not wait for statues to be found at random on their own land, but bought the best new discoveries at high prices or picked them off from older collections. What did Cardinal Riario want then so urgently but could not wait to have? A male nude Olympian god, one that was complete rather than fragmented, and a statue that could rival della Rovere's Apollo or Piccolomini's Hercules without copying them too directly. If the Apollo is one probable frame of reference in Michelangelo's statue, I would like now to turn to two other works that stand out in my mind as critical points of reference here, the two pans now in the Capitoline museums. In the Renaissance, these pans appeared, as this engraving illustrates, without their arms and without the grapes that they now hold at their sides, which are later restorations. At the time of Michelangelo's arrival in Rome, they were among the most prominent antique sculptures in the city and had been so for decades, having been discovered before the mid-1470s on farmland outside of Rome, not in the theater of Pompey, as is often stated. In 1496, they would have been visible at the palaces of the Della Valle on the Via Papalis, the city's most important ceremonial and processional street. There are several aspects of the pans that could have attracted Michelangelo's and Riario's attention. As we saw yesterday in Professor Dempsey's talk, Michelangelo certainly knew very well what the antique pan looked like before he arrived in Rome, but he had surely never seen such powerful, such impressively scaled, over life-sized, antique representations of the half-human, half-animal god. In this, it is important to consider that Michelangelo's statue represents two figures: the life-size Bacchus, who has just removed the feline skin he was wearing, and a half-human, half-animal satyr who stands half as tall as the Bacchus. The half-human, half-animal composition of the Della Valle pans, the contrast they exhibit between flayed skins and ideal bodies, and their suggestive mergence of human and architectural form, seem to echo key themes of Michelangelo's art. And it seems that these figures stimulated his imagination quite powerfully. In the Bacchus, in the slaves of the Julius tomb, which are repeated Telamon-like figures bound to the pilasters behind them, or even in the horned Moses Michelangelo also carved for Julius's tomb. Luba Friedman has, not without some disapproval from other scholars, pointed to the similarities we have just seen between the small satyr figure in the Bacchus and the Della Valle pans. However, I support her conclusions and think the comparison goes even further. The pans' proximity to the Via Papalis only added to their status as ludic figures in tune with the theatrics and Bacchic triumphs staged in Rome during carnival season, and which found their way even into the papal processions that lumbered by the Della Valle palaces. In 1513, Pope Leo X passed by the Della Valle pans when the family displayed them on the street itself, atop a triumphal arch, and Martin van Heemskerk also imagined them on such an arch in his Triumph of the Bacchus, painted in the 1530s. The high visibility and carnivalesque quality of the pans may well have appealed to Cardinal Riario, who was one of Rome's greatest patrons of theater, popular spectacle, and carnival games. And it may also have informed Michelangelo's conception of the Bacchus, where the god's overt drunkenness can be read as an allusion to the more down-to-earth popolano aspects of the wine god's identity. We have so far, following the implications of Michelangelo's letter, considered the possible meaning of specific antique sculptures in Rome for the statue's commission, yet of course Michelangelo's profound study in the 1480s and 90s of the antique in Florence, in particular the sculptures of the Medici collections, is also highly relevant in this context. The very fact of Riario's sponsorship of Michelangelo, whose identity at this time could hardly be separated from that of the Medici, is suggestive of the cardinal's hopes to take up Lorenzo de' Medici's mantle as one of Italy's greatest Maecenases in the years following Lorenzo's death, and we might expect Michelangelo's Bacchus to be elusive of the objects then in Medici possession. Here I want to call attention to a figure that does not survive, but is known through written descriptions as a Priapus, who balances a basket of fruit on his head. Priapus, god of male genitalia and gardens, was displayed in the garden of the Medici Palace in Via Larga, above a doorway, and was given a voice through an inscribed poem by Gentile de' Becchi, displayed underneath the statue. In this short epigram, that is clearly an erotic invitation. Priapus asks a young girl not to steal anything from the trees in the garden, but instead to eat the fruits that he carries on his head. Whatever, little thieving girl, what are you snatching at? So that you don't pull off my branches, I have brought these fruits for you. But beware hereafter of carrying off anything from this garden. Although I have hidden my weapons, I am Priapus. The Medici Priapus and its witty inscription may have informed Michelangelo's conception of the erotic narrative in his fertility god, the Bacchus, perhaps in keeping with the patron's interest in Michelangelo's identity as a Medici sculptor in particular. In the Medici garden, Priapus, the sex god, invites the little thieving girl to steal his fruits. And in Michelangelo's sculpture, a sexualized encounter between the Bacchus and the aroused satyr, shown here as a little thief, is implicit in the satyr's delighted tasting of the grapes. While it will never be possible to prove that this chain of references actually informs the Bacchus, I want to invoke it as the type of imitatio that may in this case have been more relevant for patron and artist than the reference to archaeologically or iconographically correct textual and visual sources. In conclusion, I want to turn briefly to the question of how the ritual functions of Curial Rome's specific brand of antiquarianism and collecting might also have left their mark on the Bacchus's subject and narrative. Riario's antiquarianism followed the example of his closest relatives at the papal court, perhaps most importantly that of Pietro Riario, his cousin and mentor until Pietro's early death in 1474. Pietro enthusiastically promoted the art of festival in Rome and staged lavish entertainments in his palace, the most famous of which was a banquet put on in June 1473 for Eleonora of Aragon. This spectacle included mimes, a ballerina, a dwarf, a number of costumed mythological characters, including Bacchus, who sung Eleonora's praises in poetry. Throughout the banquet, obsessive allusions were made to the rose, the personal insignia of the Riario family. Guests were given roses. They washed their hands with rose water. They ate edible roses sculpted in sugar, and they admired a fountain of a gilded puto urinating rose water. I think we can situate Michelangelo's Bacchus also in this realm of festive banquets and ephemeral decor, and in the themes of the countless laudatory poems written in Cardinal Raffaele Riario's honor, whose principal subject was the glorification of his patronage. In return for monetary gifts and favors, poets wrote endless such compositions, often recited during outdoor fetes and in the presence of antique and modern sculpture. Talking points included puns on the great patron's name or the features of his coat of arms, and every one of the Sicilian poet Antonio Flaminio's compositions in honor of Cardinal Riario fixated on the motif of the rose and its alluring scent. Here I am quoting just two passages from his works on Riario's patronage of painters, in which the rose's scent is given inspirational powers, which are here specifically powers of artistic inspiration. The painter to Cardinal Riario, in whose house he learned the art of painting, "If my flame shines at all in the art of Apelles, this the alluring scent of the Cyprian rose nourished," and another poem of a similar theme below. Returning to the Bacchus, in this context it is perhaps not implausible to imagine that the floral decorations on the figure's cup allude to the cardinal's insignia of the rose, in the same manner as the roses and rosettes repeated everywhere in and outside the Palazzo Riario. And I'm pointing to the courtyard here with rosette decorations, the gilded ceilings inside the palazzo with roses and rose decorations everywhere, the sculpted balconies of the palace, and even the cardinal's dishware. And this is a piece recently excavated from underneath the courtyard of the Palazzo Cancelleria. The Bacchus's facial expression, his staring eyes, parted lips, and quivering tongue, convey his intense desire to taste the contents of his cup. Yet the meaning of this moment can perhaps also be imagined as the anticipation of taste stimulated by smell. Bacchus holds a cup of wine as his familiar attribute. In the context of the original commission, however, artist and patron may have envisioned a double meaning for the cup. If the archaizing rosettes encircling it seem to suggest it holds rose water, it is even possible to imagine that it sometimes held real roses during festive occasions when the cardinal was entertained with poetry, such as Flaminios. If this were the case, then the fresh scent of Riario's rose, more powerful than any wine, implicitly drives Bacchus to a state of inspired ecstasy and intoxication. Here it is important to recall that statues in antiquity and the Renaissance were hardly the untouchable museum pieces that they are today. For special occasions, statues in the Renaissance could wear garlands, and I'm here showing a print of a sacrifice to Priapus with fruits, flowers, and libations being offered to the god. Or they could even wear costumes. During the Feast of the Pasquinades, held once a year, poets would compete to see who could write the best compositions about or in the voice of the fragmented antique statue known as the Pasquino, who would dress up according to an annual theme. In these prints, we see him in mourning or as an allegory of peace, holding an olive branch and wearing a dress. The Bacchus has been seen from many perspectives as a first expression of genius, as a reflection of the Platonic philosophy Michelangelo had absorbed in Florence. But I hope that these brief observations suggest that there is much more to be discovered about its place in the antiquarianism and collecting culture of Renaissance Rome. Thank you.